Hi. This is Circuit Tracks. In this video, I'll compare it in depth to the original circuit, then briefly to Circuit Rhythm, which isn't officially available as of the making of this video, so there's not much known. Then I'll go through a full overview of what Circuit Tracks can do, assuming you're not familiar with the original circuit. And then finally, as usual, discuss pros and cons compared to other products on the market. More of this jam at the end of this video. Let's check it out. Before I start, a quick disclosure, Novation sent this over for review. It did cost me, but lower than retail, and as always, they have no say over the content of this video. This channel is funded by viewers who subscribe to my content and book updates on Patreon, YouTube Premium and ads, whether skipped or not, and store affiliate links in the description, which help the channel regardless of the product you choose to buy. So let's jump right in and compare this to the original circuit. On the hardware side, let's talk about similarities first. The synth engine is exactly the same. You've got two independent Nova synth engines, 6-voice polyphony each, and 4 monophonic sample tracks on both. Both have the same number of pads and knobs on the panel, so 8 encoders, a master filter on the right, and a master volume on the left, and 32 velocity-sensitive pads front and center with the same number of control mode and control pads around the velocity-sensitive ones, though a few differences, as we'll see in a bit, in terms of what's available. So that's where the internals are similar. There are a few hardware changes and improvements in Circuit Tracks. If I had to name the biggest improvement in Circuit Tracks, I'd say it's the SD card slot and Trax's ability to store 32 entire machine states on it. The reason that's important is that Circuit Tracks, like the original circuit, can only store 1 minute of samples that must be shared across all 64 sample slots and all the onboard sessions or projects. With the new circuit, the machine state is called a pack, and you can store up to 32 packs on the SD card. Swapping out packs takes a bit, but it's not too bad. It's only a few seconds, so if I say want to go from this pack to this pack, just hit play, and that's pretty much it. I can now access 64 completely different samples in this pack, and obviously 64 different sessions, or projects as they're called here, completely different patterns. So the entire machine state, basically 32 of those immediately accessible on the SD card. It's not included, by the way, but you don't need much storage for this, so these cards are typically pretty cheap. So this lets you be much less stingy with samples as you explore different ideas in different packs. You still can't sample into Circuit Tracks though, so you'll need to load up samples using the components software, just like you did with the old circuit. Aside from the SD card and packs, there are a few big and important hardware changes. Next up, I think in terms of importance, are 2 new MIDI sequencing tracks and an additional MIDI output. So you can now sequence 2 other synths without giving up the internal synth tracks. So here, for example, this is internal synth 1, this is internal synth 2, and then MIDI track 1 is controlling Typhon over here. Now another big new change is that you've got 2 external inputs, so you're hearing Typhon now as fed through the input, and this can pass both through the effects as well as through Sidechain. So there are 2 of these inputs, either for a stereo synth or for 2 external mono synths, and you control them in the mixer just like they were an internal synth, including panning. Another fun difference is that the new Circuit Tracks has a built-in rechargeable battery. You could power the original circuit with 6 AA batteries, but I think an internal battery is a big improvement. Aside from that, there are a few other hardware changes. You've got full-size MIDI jacks instead of the 3.5mm ones where you needed a dongle, and you've got 2 outputs or a single output and a MIDI through over here. The headphone jack was moved to the back. I actually preferred it up front, and you can't power this with a 12-volt adapter, only through USB-C, not USB-B. Either one is fine. And USB-C also charges the internal battery. Another new output is an analog sync output to gear that accepts analog clock, and you can set the timing difference, the PPQN basically, to a few possible relative timing options. The velocity sensitive pads also are slightly different, not as bright and thick as these, but overall work well. And the final difference is that the new circuit doesn't have a built-in speaker, which I have to say I never found useful. Design is a matter of taste. I think this build is much sleeker, slanted is always better, and they lost the blue color, which I think is an improvement. They're both just as wide, and Circuit Tracks is just a little bit taller. Let's talk about a few internal differences. Aside from the 2 new MIDI tracks, the 4 drum tracks have now been decoupled. You can control them independently of each other. On the old circuit, you had to control them in pairs, so drum 1 and drum 2, and drum 3 and drum 4 were always grouped together in patterns and in sequencing. You couldn't ever split them apart. Other differences in order of importance, I think. Each pattern can now be up to 32 steps long as opposed to up to 16 steps long on the original circuits. You still have 8 patterns per track. Another fun difference, you now have 128 presets. So there are 4 pages of 32 presets each. And another fun difference on the drum side, you can now browse presets directly from the sequencer. So before you could see 2 tracks at once, and it was fun to sequence 2 tracks at once. Maybe they can add that to here, say by pressing both drum tracks. Anyway, but I think this is a better deal overall. You can try out all the presets directly from here. You can page through these as well. 64 drum presets, and you can also use these for sample flipping. We'll talk about that in a bit. Also, the Components software has a new and improved look with additional functionality and easier controls. I don't know if the original circuit will get this upgraded user interface. Time will tell. One thing that may seem like a difference but is not is the labeling of the macro knobs on the panel. The macro knobs do the same thing, meaning control any parameter or parameters that the patch designer decided they control on either circuit. The labeling is kind of like traffic lights in New York City, more like a recommendation for sound design than something people actually follow, but I did go over the factory presets, and indeed, most of them adhere more or less to this convention, so overall, it's a welcome addition to have these labels, and hopefully people that create new patches will adhere to them. When relevant to the patch, you obviously don't want to limit yourself only to these 8 parameters because there are plenty of other goodies in the Nova engine. One more comparison that needs to be made is to Circuit Rhythm that was unintentionally leaked. Now, unfortunately, I don't have one to compare. I don't have any final confirmation on what Circuit Rhythm can do, so I'll just say what Circuit Tracks can do compared to what a leaked image hints that Circuit Rhythm might. Circuit Tracks can't sample, though it does have audio inputs. I don't know if it's possible to add that capability in a firmware update. Anyway, it only accepts sample files from a computer, and its sample sound design options are relatively limited. You've got continuous pitch, which you can't quantize or play melodies with without my template, of course, which we'll talk about later on. Then you've got a decay envelope control, basically how long the sample plays, distortion, and EQ. So you can't loop samples, you can't reverse them, you can't slice them, and Circuit Tracks only has 2 effects, a delay and a reverb, as well as a master compressor, as opposed to potentially other grid effects. We don't know what that is now. So can Circuit Rhythm do all those other things and more? I don't know. If I ever get my hands on one for review, I'll be sure to tell you. Okay, so that's it for the comparison. Now, if you're not familiar with Circuit, let's start from scratch. Circuit Tracks has 8 tracks in total, 2 polyphonic synth tracks, 2 MIDI sequencing tracks for controlling external gear, and 4 monophonic sample tracks. They're called Drum 1, Drum 2, 3, and 4, but you can place any sample you want on it subject to the total 60-second sample limitation per pack. It's got 32 velocity-sensitive pads. You use these for multiple purposes, whether it's sequencing steps in a sequence, choosing patterns that you want Circuit to play, choosing presets, again, all based on the context of the buttons around the 32 pads. There's a master filter knob that goes from outside the club to in the car radio, low pass to high pass, and master volume, and then These 8 encoders control different things, again, based on the mode or view that you're in. Like I mentioned earlier, these labels are relevant mainly for the synth presets. For the other modes or views, they do different things. So for the MIDI tracks, they control MIDI CCs, up to 8 MIDI CCs, and you've got 8 templates that you can choose from for different external instruments. And on the drum tracks, they control the 4 parameters we discussed earlier. You can see that everything is pretty much color-coded to the track you're on. And when you're on the mixer or effects, then each macro knob or each encoder basically controls the track that it's aligned with. So for example, on the mixer page, you're controlling levels for each of the 8 tracks. On the effects page, you're controlling sends for the delay and reverb on a per track basis. Then another overall interface convention you need to be aware of are these arrows. So for example, if I'm choosing presets, I can move through the pages using these arrows. If I'm on the mixer page, there's another page which controls panning for each of the tracks. So sometimes there are things that are a little bit hidden that you can access with these arrows, like the panning, or say, for example, sidechain, you can control for the 2 synth tracks. And then if you press the down arrow, you can see it's lit up here. That hints that you can control additional things, in this case, sidechain for the external inputs. Another great user interface hint is the LED brightness. So for example, you can see mixer levels, say on the kick track. Now it's all the way down. So as you move between the different screens and go to the mixer screen, I know that levels are down for the kick immediately just by the brightness of this LED. Another important user interface convention, a short tap will change to the view of whatever it is that you pressed. A long tap is a temporary change. So let's say that I wanted to go into the mixer but stay controlling synth 1. I could hold this pad, change whatever I wanted in the mixer, and when I release this, I go back to controlling the synth. Another convention is a double tap. So for example, if I wanted to play on all the pads, not just these bottom pads, I could hit note mode to access that and go back, or just hit shift and note. Same here. So for effects, I could go into the sidechain page, toggle effects in sidechain, or just hit shift. Either way. Okay, let's take a closer look at circuit sequencing. Sequencing for drums and synths is relatively similar, but there are a few differences. Let's start with drums because it's a little bit simpler. You've got 16 steps viewable at a time, and that's how you can sequence a pattern. Quite simple. And where it gets interesting is sample flipping. So by default, you choose any sound you want, like I mentioned over here, and you can page through different pages for different samples. Sample flipping is pretty neat. Say you heard a sample that you like, you can long press it and just place it anywhere you want. So let's just place a few random samples here. Let's not do that. And okay, you've got a sample flipped beat. It also works the other way around, so you can long press a step and see which sample is assigned to that step, unless it's the default sample, in which case you just see this. Another important thing you should know is that patterns can be up to 32 steps long. Unlike the original circuit where they're only 16, you activate that just by pressing this button. So now we've got another page. So the first page plays, and then this is the second page where we can add more stuff into. You can also hit clear to delete that. Go back to a 16-step pattern. Let's add that again. And this is how you toggle between the two. Notice that the cursor follows the half of the pattern that's playing. If you hit shift and view lock, you can work on the second half while the first half plays. You can also set any pattern length you want under 32 steps or under 16 steps. Let's just clear this. So this is our original pattern. If we go into pattern settings, I could shorten it. So you could use that for fills potentially. And you can also set a different start position with shift. This is great for polymetric variety, of course. So really neat both sequencing and performance options here. While we're on the pattern settings page, you can also use this to change the relative speed of a pattern, which is very useful in the context of other patterns, of course. And you can also set the pattern direction. I mean, you'd have it go back. This sounds pretty random as is, so you won't hear a big difference. Go back and forth, ping pong, or just play randomly. Again, a pattern like this doesn't mean much, but you can, and it's an interesting sort of generative technique for melodic patterns. So let's clear this up to something slightly more normal. Anyway, let's talk about melodic sequencing. Like I mentioned, it's very similar, but slightly different. You go into any of the synth tracks, and then to sequence, you either hold a note and place it anywhere you want on the timeline, on the steps. And another option is to hold the step and say play a chord. And a nice feature is that you can preview the chord and then maybe program another chord. You could actually use this for chord performance bank without sequencing anything. Now, up until now, I've been playing in a minor scale, but you've got a bunch of scales in here, 16 different options. You can see the piano style LEDs light up in the form of a full keyboard when it's a chromatic scale, and when it's not, you see which notes are part of that scale. So this is minor and this is major, and you can also transpose a pattern or choose a different root note by pressing the different notes in the scale. Now, aside from step sequencing, you can also play live into patterns, either using the pads or an external MIDI keyboard if you like. You can record either quantized or unquantized. Let's go for unquantized. Go into synth 1, and let's make this 32 steps long. Yeah, just hit record, play, and yeah. I didn't unmute this, let's unmute this. You can also activate a metronome using the click function. Pretty straightforward. Same goes, by the way, for the drum tracks. So you could either play the flips live. Now, notice drum tracks are monophonic, so you can't hit 2 notes at a time. You can use this for chokes, but you can't play 2 sounds at the same time on the same track. If you want to play more than 1 sample simultaneously, hit note, then you've got access to all 4 tracks at once. Once you've got the steps in place, you can edit a few of their parameters. So let's say if I felt these notes were a little bit too loud, I could change the velocity of the notes by hitting velocity, which goes into velocity view. You can then pick a note and then just edit its velocity to something that doesn't distort quite as much across both page. So leave some variety, but I recorded this in fixed velocity mode, but you can disable that as well. So that's how you edit velocity, for example. You edit gate length, same way basically if I want this to play for longer. You don't hear it here. That's how you determine gate, again on a per step basis. Micro step, by the way, shows you micro timing for the steps. So you can see that when you record unquantized, it's far from perfect. You can fix that if you want or not. There are 6 micro steps for each step, so I could organize this. By the way, when you play chords, you can set the micro timing for each of the notes in a chord, which is pretty cool for micro strums. Circuit also supports probability per step. Remember, double tap or shift tap. So now all the notes are playing. Let's pattern lock and say if I wanted these to play only, half the time or 30% of the time. So adding probability to some or all of the notes in a pattern, whether it's a bass line or a melody, is a great way to keep it interesting. Let's do it for the other 16 steps as well. Now, up until now, the randomization features I showed you, the random pattern order and probability, aren't destructive. So if I wanted things to be back the way they were, I could just increase probability to 100%. Let's not do that fully. Another nice random function is mutate, but that's destructive, meaning it will change the pattern completely. If you're going to do that, it's a good idea to save your pattern. You can double tap save, or if you wanted to save it into a different project or session as they're called on Circuit, you go into projects, hit save, choose an empty slot. So now I've got this saved here and I can ruin it without worrying about anything. Anyway, hit play. Let's say that I wanted to mutate this pattern, shift and mutate. So you never know what you're going to get. It might be good, it might not. Sometimes mutate can pleasantly surprise, but if not, it's always good to have a backup you can go back to. Drum tracks are very similar, except that, let's maybe go for a hi-hat sound. except that microsteps lets you add ratchets as well. So let's go for the all-in for the hi-hats and unmute this. Anyway, so with microsteps I could go into a step and then add additional ratchets. So a nice way to change the groove of your pattern alongside swing, of course. And then one last tip for playing live. If you want to just play live into a sequence, you could see up to 4 octaves at a time if you hit the expand option. And you can transpose octaves. So pretty broad range across these 32 steps. So that's sequencing. Let's talk about automation. So each of these knobs controls different parameters, as we know, but you can automate them. You can automate this motion as the sequence plays, and you can either do that live or step sequence that as well. So we've got our parameters, let's say like this. Let's say that we wanted to automate this, just hit record and then make the motion. And when you're done, immediately release record. And you've now recorded this automation. If you want to clear an automation, just hit clear, turn this left, and it's gone. Then you could repeat for any of the knobs. You can also edit the knobs on a per step basis. So just hit record and change the parameters. So let's say I want these 3 to be like that here, and maybe like this here. So different sounds, different values on a per step basis. These transitions, by the way, can sometimes produce very interesting artifacts. So let's hear what that sounds like when played. Yeah, and if you don't like that, just clear, 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 and it's back to normal, hopefully. Okay. One last thing about automation, not only that you can automate the macro knobs for each of the tracks, you can also automate the mixer controls. So let's say that I wanted to pan the bass. Remember, that's the second page here. So just hit record. And to the extent that we want to, we've now automated the panning of the bass. MIDI sequencing works the same way. I'll unmute this track, which means that I can now play it and hear the synth coming in. Yeah, it's the same deal. I can even sequence the same pattern if I wanted to. So and like I mentioned earlier, the mixer controls apply to external audio coming in the analog input as well. So for example, I could change panning. Or remember, if I hit page up on the mixer, I can control the level of the incoming audio. And let's talk a little bit about effects. You've got a master reverb and delay, and you control the sends to those effects. There are presets for both, for the delay and for the reverb. 8 presets for the reverb, 16 presets for the delay. And the beauty of MIDI sequencing is that you've got hands-on controls on whatever instrument it is that you're sequencing. And let's pan the bass back to the center. Let's continue the tour and talk about Sidechain. Let's unmute these. So these are my pads, and here we go into Sidechain. So Sidechain is the second page on the effects, and I've had it on all along. So the way Sidechain works is you can turn it off. You choose what you want to guide it. Any one of the drums. I'll choose the kick, of course. And then you can choose which tracks it applies to. So this is synth 1, this is synth 2. And as I increase the sidechain, the kick will increasingly duck the pads to make way for the kick. And I can also do the same thing for the external input. So this is external input number 1. So now I'm ducking the bass. Maybe if I turn the pads off, you'll hear it a little bit better. If you're familiar with the old circuit, it'll take a while to get used to paging up and down to get to the sidechain. So page down, and you get to control the sidechain of the external inputs. And it takes some fine tuning, but sidechain is a really important sound design tool because the bass and the kick are basically fighting over the same frequency, and sidechain lets the bass make way for the kick and then brings it back in when the kick is out of the picture. Okay, let's start zooming out to longer patterns and how we build songs. If we go into the patterns view, we can view up to 8 patterns for each track. You need to page up and down to see all 8. So the 8 patterns for the MIDI tracks are first page and second page here. Unlike the original circuit where you saw all the patterns on the same page because you only had effectively 4 different tracks, here you've got 8 tracks, so you've got to look at them split screen. Anyway, let's say that I wanted to make a variation on this bass line. I can duplicate it to a new pattern and then go ahead to that pattern. It's the same thing, so we'll hear the same thing. Let's maybe change it up a bit. I'll just make it a simpler pattern. Duplicate, just copy this like that. Go to the other page and let's leave that as is. Cool. So that's pattern number 2. Now I could either perform with this and move back and forth between the two, or just chain the patterns by choosing the first pattern and the second one, and then circuit will move from the first pattern to the second one, and back to the first one. Now occasionally you might want to edit one pattern while another is playing. In this case, you can enter view lock mode and then change the pattern you're editing without changing the pattern you're playing by hitting Shift and the pattern you want to edit. So let's take a look at that. Let's play this pattern, hit view lock mode, and hit Shift, and go to this pattern. Notice the patterns have now turned white. We're still hearing the old pattern. Let's make an even more extreme change to this one. Let's just clear everything here. Hit duplicate. You can duplicate, by the way, across pages. So now we've completely changed this pattern to this. Now we can go back to the patterns and then unlock them. And let's make this chain again. Okay, static. And back to here. When view lock is unlocked, then you can use Shift to make immediate changes in patterns. Zooming out even further, you can program multiple pattern changes using scenes. So let's see how that would work. I'll go into the mixer, unmute my hi-hats, and maybe go into patterns and then duplicate this pattern to another one. Then go ahead and edit that, and maybe let's make it less busy. Okay, so that's pattern 2, and this is pattern 1. But let's say that I wanted to change both of these at once, and and a bunch of other things that wasn't easy for me to do across these 2 pages. So the way that that works is, let's choose, say, this as scene 1. Okay, then you go into the mixer, and these pads on the bottom are your 16 available scenes, and you hold Shift and choose a scene to assign whatever patterns were selected to that scene. Then you can go back into the patterns view, choose different patterns, then go back into the mixer and assign that to a different scene. So now within the comfort of the mixer, I could choose scene 1, have that play, and then, unmute or mute stuff, then go to scene 2, where I get both the melodic bass and the different hi-hats or any other patterns. And you can also chain scenes if you wanted just like you can change patterns. So this will play first. And then this one, and you've got 16 of those scenes. So that's pretty much sequencing on circuit. Like I mentioned, you've got 64 different projects, right? So this is something you don't need to load from the SD card. They use the same samples, but other than that, it's 64 different patterns in every one. So this is a session or project. Sorry, I'm used to sessions here. This is another one. Another one. You can queue them up. And again, they can be completely different. The thing that projects or sessions have in common is that they use the same samples. If you load up a different pack, those packs can then use completely different samples and obviously have different patterns as well. Okay, the last piece of the circuit puzzle is the components software. You can download this to your computer or use the online service from Novation with a MIDI capable browser. Components is the only way that you can swap out these samples in the packs and the only way that you can edit and design synth sounds beyond the basic macro knobs. Component also lets you edit the 8 different CC templates for controlling external synths. Now, exploring the hardcore synth side of circuit is a topic for a whole other video, but I do want to call your attention to this. Once you sync up the two, you can immediately see and edit any one of the presets or create some of your own across both synths. Notice the colors change as well as everything else on the preset. So this really acts like a kind of BYOS, bring your own screen for circuit. Anything that you change on circuit will also change on screen. Pretty smooth and fast connection there. And also anything you change on screen will impact circuit. Again, we won't go through all of this, but creating a new patch is really easy. And let's just do create patch. This is the default preset. So obviously you can go ahead and edit any of the synth parameters. There's a lot to explore here. So really worth diving in. Assigning macros is also really easy. So let's say that I wanted to assign macro 5, which I should, right? Because it's the filter frequency to the filter frequency. Just drag from over here onto the frequency over here, and you use this to determine the mod depth. It should work. This is a beta, but anyway, I now control the filter frequency. I could make another assignment from here. You get up to 4 assignments per macro knob, which is why they're called macros. Let's just tie this to resonance as well. Okay, so here we go. So a really nice way to get you started in creating your own patches. I think this version of components is as coherent as it ever was. Makes it a lot easier to find your way around. These, by the way, are the mod assignments for the different macros, and this is the mod matrix, up to 20 slots in the matrix with 2 mod sources per slot, a mod depth, whether positive or negative, and a mod destination. The last thing that I wanted to talk about before we get to the pros and cons was a few tips, tricks, and ideas for circuit. Many of the ideas that applied to the original circuit also apply to circuit tracks. So if you see a circuit video online, whether mine or otherwise, it will likely be applicable to circuit tracks as well. I'll put a post on my Patreon with all my tips and ideas for making more out of circuit. There's just one that I wanted to share with you here because it's the one that kind of got this channel started, and I've created a new template to make it work here, which is playing melodies with the samples. So as you may recall, you've got 4 sample controls, and pitch is a continuous control. So it's very hard to program melodies with this as automation, which is why I created this template. And the idea is simple. You could either play this live in one of the velocity or gate modes, and you've got 2 pages in this pattern, and you can change the preset too. So if I didn't want this preset and, let's say wanted to play this preset, I could. The click, by the way, is the sample starting at the expense of the previous sample. So if you play short notes, you won't get a click. So in this template, there are two patterns, one for the upper octave and a half, and goes up to this A, and then the second pattern is for the bottom two octaves. Tuning in the bottom octave is a bit sketchy, but as long as you stick to the upper octave and a half, you'll be fine. And yeah, you can apply this to kicks as well, to any of the sounds that are in here. So let's say that I wanted to play this kick. Yeah, add some distortion. And you get pitched, distorted kicks using samples. So you can either play these samples live or duplicate them across a pattern to sequence them. I'll put these templates as well as plenty of other tips and tricks and ideas in a Patreon post linked below. Okay, let's take a look at the pros and cons of circuit tracks. Now, when looking at pros and cons, they need to be evaluated in comparison to alternatives on the market. So when I came to compare circuit tracks, I was actually quite surprised by how few grooveboxes exist at this price range. By grooveboxes, I mean standalone, all-in-one boxes that can make music, including drums, a few synth parts, and maybe sequence an external synth or two. At this price range, I think there are the Korg Electribes, the Roland MC101, and I think that's basically it. Obviously, if you include in-production grooveboxes. Now go $200 or $300 higher and you start to see some serious heavyweights, but at this price, not so much. So how does this compare? The sequencer and user interface, I think, are top-notch, both easy to use and powerful. You've got automation, probabilities, different pattern speeds, and play directions, substeps, great stuff. The main thing that bothered me about the original circuit, that there was no screen or clear indication of what the macro knobs did, nor could you control all of the synth's parameters, and sample storage was limited to 1 minute, and that you couldn't play melodies with samples without a workaround like the one I showed you. These limitations essentially remain in circuit tracks, but they've been somewhat alleviated. Regarding the macro knobs, there's still no screen to tell you what they do or change what they control, and there's no hard rule, nor should there be, that you or preset designers need to follow the labels, but the presets are pretty consistent with the labeling, which does help things a bit. If you do want to dive in and edit the presets, the components software now looks really good and syncs up with this really nicely. Ultimately, Circuit's synth is so feature-rich, there's no way you could fit all of its parameters here anyway. So if you don't mind having a computer around when you're editing your patches, you can essentially bring your own 27-inch screen if you want as a companion to Circuit. The one limit total on samples in memory at a time still exists, but having the 32 packs on the SD card relatively quickly available opens this up substantially for exploring different samples. Where circuit tracks could use some more chops is in the sample editing territory. Right now, you've only got the 4 controls we talked about. Now, these knobs are unused, so hint, hint, it would be nice to get maybe a sample start option here, maybe a couple of other sample options like reverse using the unused knobs. In the old circuit, all the knobs were used because you controlled 2 drum tracks at a time. These are now freed up. If you'd like a more detailed comparison to the competition, I'll link below to my old video comparing the original circuit to the Electribes and to the MC101 review. If you watch those and this video, you'll know everything I do and hopefully you'll have enough to make a decision. On the pros side, it certainly looks like Circuit is back. It looks better, it has 2 new sequencing tracks and 2 MIDI outputs, so now it's competing for the brains of a small setup. It's got 2 feature-rich synths that can give you serious sound design options if you're willing to pair it with a component software, and the 32 sound pack slots, which load up relatively quickly, means you've got substantially more sample storage easily accessible. Finally, aside from perhaps a few cryptic options on the settings page where you'll need to refer to the manual, Circuit is dead easy to use. There's 0 menu diving on Circuit, and it's refreshing to have a groovebox that's so feature-rich and yet planned that way with no screen or menu from the ground up. And if you'd like plenty of tips on what to do with the sound design power of Circuit, check out my ever-expanding book of electronic music ideas, tips, and tricks available to the good people who support this channel on Patreon. Hit like if this was useful, and don't forget to ring the YouTube bell if you don't want to miss the next one. Thanks for watching.